Morning, everyone. Is that on? Yeah, there it is. Okay. Sorry about that. Chairman Finch will be here in a little while. He had another engagement prior to this meeting, so you'll see him walk in and steal the gavel from me. For our committee members, the hard copy of the presentation today from Paul Snyder, he was going to be on March 1 on Tuesday, but we ran out of time, so he was kind enough to let us push him to Thursday today. And so his handout is in the March 1 folder in your packet there. So we've got three presenters today, and our first one up is Paul Snyder with Kansas for lower electric rates and Kansas industrial consumers. Welcome to the committee, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, members of the committee. I am Paul Snyder, representing Kansas Industrial Consumers Group, and also Kansas for lower electric rates. And in response to Tuesday's question, I consider myself the appropriate and perfect balance of good, bad, and ugly. Different percentages, but you know, I think it all works together. So you guys heard a lot on Tuesday. There was a lot of information to go through. I will not take nearly as much time. I think our chief message is that our rates are not competitive, and we don't have an easy solution with the current regulatory framework to achieve competitive rates. We, of course, have been vocal on this issue for a number of years now, starting in 2018. Before I get started, I do want to introduce Jim Zakira. Jim has decades of experience in oil, gas, and electric issues in Kansas, and he is also the current chair of CAPERS. So if you guys have CAPERS questions, you can go to Jim after the meeting. So before we really dig in, I want to kind of give. Before we dig in, just kind of want to do a couple foundational issues. Mr. Grady covered this. This is really a reminder. The way that we achieve rates, we come up with a revenue requirement. The formula is there. In operating expenses, I didn't include taxes and depreciation, but those are a part of operating expenses in this formula. And then you take that revenue requirement and you divide it by the kilowatt hours that our utilities expected to achieve. We'll come back to this. This is an important point, but I think one thing I want to mention now is that if we grow that level of kilowatt hours, that spreads those costs over everyone. So to the extent that we can get more industrial load or figure out some way that residential consumers are going to use more, that will benefit everyone. And so I think the core thing that you need to understand and is integral to kind of our main message is that utilities make money by investing money. If you go back to this, if you increase this rate base number in the formula, that's the other way to achieve higher earnings for a company. A utility can't just flip a switch and get more sales necessarily. That's generally weather dependent, but you can achieve higher earnings if you increase that rate base number as part of the formula. A couple accounting principles just want to mention. So there is as utilities invest in a asset, those assets depreciate over time. Each year, a portion of the rate base comes out, more goes in. There are ways to limit rate increases if you slow down the spending. Evergy, under this example, can spend $880 million a year in capital expenditures. You wouldn't have a rate increase until they start going over that amount. I've got other slides that show they're very much over that amount. And then also some states take different approaches. They have longer depreciation schedules. For instance, Iowa depreciates their wind assets generally over 40 years. Kansas does it generally 20 to 25 years. This, I won't get deeply into this, but there are residential customers, commercial customers, and industrial customers. And even within industrial customers, there are different levels of service that different customers take. You can come back and refer to that at your leisure. So in 2019, we passed somewhat landmark study bill legislation that prompted the legislature, required the legislature to hire some outside consultants to look at how our rates, the general premise of the bill was to figure out, number one, why our rates got to the level that they are, but how do we get competitive rates in the future? There are a couple key takeaways that we would like to highlight. Number one is that the current rate making methods favor utilities. There's a bit of an imbalance in how one of the chief, items that we see that impacts are surcharges. Mr. Grady listed a number of surcharges, and we'll focus on one in particular in a moment. Also, we've got underutilized assets that are a drag on rates. Evergy has done a great job greening up their fleet. The issue is we haven't taken away anything. Those have just been layered on top of the existing coal and gas assets that we have. Consequently, a lot of those coal assets aren't being used as much as they were at one time, but we're still paying the full cost for those. And so one of the bills you passed last year, securitization, can help with that, but it is a process and it's a big issue that needs to be addressed and focused on. So that rate study really confirmed what we already knew, that Kansas had higher rates than all of the surrounding states, and a list of folks that have done those analysis. Also, the KC has done their own, Evergy has done their own for some of their board of directors. All those indicate that Kansas is out of whack with our regional peers. So we started in 2018 and showed this chart. This was our initial chart that we used to raise awareness for where we're at. Kansas is all the way on the end. So if we, and this is, Mr. Grady, emphasized that this is the EIA, the Energy Information Agency data. So it's not perfect, but it's a good surrogate to say directionally where we're at. We've got some other specific data to compare in just a moment. So fast forward to where we are now. Colorado, really the main change is Colorado has increased and is really pretty much neck and neck with Kansas, but core states of Arkansas, Oklahoma, Iowa, and others haven't really changed relative to Kansas. We remain much higher than others. Put an example on the right. A large manufacturer that would look to come to Kansas would have a bill of nearly $19 million. Well, if they located in Tulsa, that bill would be less than $10 million. In Des Moines, just under $14 million. In Fayetteville, $14 million. So there are some real challenges. If you've got an energy-intensive industry that's looking to come to Kansas, we have to question why would they come here versus another state if they're going to be out of pocket that much. And this doesn't just apply to large industrial customers. If you look at a residential customer, they would pay $117 a month, assuming an average of 940 kilowatt hours a month. If that customer lived in Oklahoma City, they'd be paying $33 a month less. In Tulsa, $29 a month or less. In Fayetteville, $20 a month less. That adds up for a lot of our Kansans that are struggling month to month with bills. Some of the reasons that rates have gone up have been covered. A lot of them were environmental retrofits and new generation and items like that. Through that, the rates increased far greater than the rate of inflation, and so that's just a challenge. As those were going through, there wasn't, at least in retrospect, a lot of regard for where we placed ourselves in the region. But now we're at this point where we've got higher rates, and we need a solution. One of the challenges we're facing is there hasn't been any material electric load growth in more than 10 or 12 years. That's the impact of energy efficient appliances, energy efficient homes, and just the commercial and industrial loads have just been fairly stagnant. Residential has gone down a little bit. We don't see any signs of that changing in the future, absent something like grand changes from electric vehicle charging. That could make a difference. And then certainly, as we get more industrial customers to Kansas, that would help as well. But right now, what we're doing is we've got increased costs, declining people to pay for it. So you're going to be paying more using the same or less. It's just not a good business model that Kansans can support. So you've all heard and has been well trumpeted that Evergy is in a 5-year rate-based moratorium. And that is true. The challenge with that is roughly 50% of your bill is made up of surcharges that are outside of rate base. And so one of the things that's driving that is the transmission delivery charge. This is a statute that was put in place in 2003, I believe, that gave utilities the opportunity to get quick surcharge and cost recovery for transmission investments. Started out fine, but now transmission investment is a growth opportunity for utilities, and they're exploiting the quick cost recovery and adding to their shareholder value proposals. And so outside of this rate moratorium, Evergy has continued to increase rates. You can see the chart there, $31 million, $3 million, 38. Now, just 2 weeks ago, they announced another rate increase of $20 million. The Kansas Corporation Commission is basically, their hands are tied to some degree by the legislative statute that directs how they should move forward with that, with those TDC increases. So this is a chart, and I'd be happy if someone needs a larger version, I can send this to you. This is a chart that uses Edison Electric Institute specific rate data for individual utilities. When we do utility comparisons, we don't compare Evergy to, no offense to Liberty, but we don't compare them to Liberty utilities. We compare them to like-size utilities and other metropolitan areas where industrial customers tend to locate in the surrounding states. So this is data from that. The residential comparisons and industrial comparisons that were on that map chart came from data from this chart. And so you can see in Tulsa, the two in Oklahoma, their rates are just under half as much as Evergy Central and more than half less than Evergy Metro. That's a real challenge. And it's a chicken and egg. How do we all know, and everyone will readily admit, we need to grow economic development and get industrial customers to Kansas. But how do we do it with our rates that aren't conducive to luring them to Kansas? Oklahoma just announced they're having a lot of success getting data centers and data mining for Bitcoin in Oklahoma because their rates are less than 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So we need to do something to address that. I also want to note there have been some references on Tuesday to Evergy rates increasing at a slow rate, or even last year they had a decline. Evergy certainly highlighted that they've had a decrease. In 2020, their rates went down. The problem with those discussions, it leaves out a great deal of context in why that rate is going down. Number one, base rates aren't changing except for the fact they were adjusted down for income tax reductions. The 2017 federal income tax reductions that were put into place, combined with the state income tax reduction that you all passed in 2020, accounted for $475 million of reductions in Evergy rates from 2018 to 2021. That, coupled with a much smaller amount, about $30 million in merger credits, were the reasons those rates went down. So it wasn't some directed reason that had anything to do with competitive rates. Still, we all appreciate rates going down, but we need to be honest about why those rates are going down. So we, again, have been active since 2018. We first started in the Senate with a Senate resolution that called on the KCC to try to fix our problem, bring us to competitive rates. If not, come back to the legislature, tell us what steps we need to take to get there. In 2019, we passed the electric rate study. And then in 2020, we did pass the income tax elimination that reduced rates about $30 million. And just important to note that benefited customers, not just of Evergy, but also of the investor-owned natural gas companies as well. And then last year worked on securitization. So we've been active. We know that there is interest and that you all hear from constituents and others about our rate challenges. And so we were hoping that that would have some sort of positive impact and get us to where we need to be, but that hasn't been the case at all. Since 2018, Evergy's increased their capital expenditure estimates 75%. at the end of the merger, or as a condition of the merger, it was, or perhaps not an explicit condition, but a concession that was offered and talked about during the merger, was that the combined company would be able to reduce their capital expenditures by $1 billion down to $6 billion. And we were on a decent path until 2020, early 2020, and then they start to increase extensively. And every 3 to 6 months, they just re-ratchet up how much they're going to spend. Even after last November, the commission in their sustainability transformation plan docket regarding Evergy's investments raised a red flag and said that they're very concerned about these rates. And then Evergy just threw on a couple $300 million onto their estimate as well. So if it weren't such a dire circumstance for some customers, it would really be interesting to watch this gamesmanship between the KCC and Evergy with regard to their returns. So that brings me to the STP. I won't get into this explicitly, but this is their spending plan, and it's been well documented that this is a value creation mechanism and is designed to create maximum shareholder value for Evergy. And it's going to translate into one of the largest rate increases in Kansas history. As reported in the Wichita Eagle, it's going to increase rates 10 to 11%. And it's just not something that we believe that the Kansas economy can sustain and grow at the same time. And then not only as we go through that next rate increase, they've got more planned, a similar amount planned from 2025 to 2030. So I think the bottom line is that the current regulatory process isn't positioned to get us to competitive rates, isn't stopping the current increases that we see today. And so we really need to start looking at other alternatives. One of those alternatives would be deregulation. This was highlighted as a section in the rate study plan. We don't have a specific plan, but we do think there needs to be some more discussion about that. And that doesn't need to be deregulation for everyone. It can be limited just to business customers. There's a number of variations you can consider. Another key aspect is performance-based rates. So I talked about how Evergy is spending money because that's the only clear way they have to increase shareholder value and increase earnings and profits. Well, let's give them a different way to get to that point. Let's maybe incent them to get to competitive rates. At the end of the day, we don't really care how much profit they have as long as we have competitive rates for our members. And then finally, maybe we need to consider Kcc reforms. That could be including election of commissioners. That's what Oklahoma and Nebraska do. Other states in the SPP do that as well. Maybe we need to review the charter of the KCC. You all created the KCC. You can do a lot of things to impact that. I do not support the notion that we have a government sanctioned monopoly, but yet no way to set goals and metrics for how they should be performing. So that is a lot to cover, and I'm here every day, as you all know. I'm easy to find. Happy to engage you at any time, and happy right now to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Questions? Anybody from the committee? Leo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if I want to say question or if I may just make a comment on it.
That'd be fun. Sure.
I appreciated the other day that the KCC was in and gave the testimony also, that I know you were supposed to be there same day, but continuation. This is going to sound a little off the chart, but have you ever heard of PBMs? Not the utility related, but pharmacy benefit managers. This is a loaded
Thank you for
question.
the context. I was sitting there going through.
This is a loaded question. I just want to read what pharmacy benefit managers do, and it's a short one, I promise. But they develop and maintain lists and formulas of covered medications on behalf of health insurers. And that influences which drugs individuals can use, and it determines the cost of the drugs used. And it also, they contract directly with the pharmacies to determine the drugs and the reimbursements. And the reason I bring this up is I got to sit, it was 2 years ago now, on a joint House-Senate committee going through this stuff. And what I learned, where I was a little bit out of my element, is the formulas and the way that industry works is so convoluted that the average Joe can never understand how the rates of the drugs are coming up or how the cost or what drives what everybody gets. And I see a direct parallel with this. You know, for those of us that may understand the industry, it's one thing, but those that don't, the majority of them, it is so convoluted. We've got to come up with some other formulas so that people can understand what they're paying, what they're getting, and how can we fix some of this stuff. So I appreciate you making the testimony, and thank you for letting me kind of take off on a tangent here.
First time we've talked about pharmacy benefit managers here in Utilities Committee, but anyway. Next question is from Representative Keither. She's online.
Good morning. Good morning, Paul. I find it curious, and I don't know if this is the time to do it, but that you mentioned deregulation, because that was what was at the top of the list of issues when I first came into service, and called retail wheeling. You're saying it's not for everybody, but I mean, in looking at what happened with Winter Storm Uri, look what happened with Texas. So I find it sort of curious that you would even mention even looking at that, because I think we all know right now that that is certainly not a good way to go. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you for the comment, and no doubt deregulation did have some issues in Texas with regard to residential customers and the availability of services for them. That's why I said I think there are different ways to shield residential customers in that, and there's different ways to limit that to investor-owned versus municipals versus cooperatives. There's a lot of different ways you could thoughtfully approach that, and deregulation was not something that our group ever proposed. In fact, I would note our group has never proposed a bill that benefited our customers over someone else, over residential or other customers. We've just never done that here in this building. We did include it. There was some pressure, not necessarily coming from our group, to include it in the rate study. So we did, I guess, compromise and have it was relatively short. It was a 1 or 2 or 3 page section in the rate study about deregulation. But I think we're to the point now where we've seen our existing systems fail. We need some sort of alternative, so it is worthy, in our view, of review.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I may, would you get that to me, please? Or if the chairman would like to get those 3 pages to the committee to look at, I would appreciate it.
That's 3 pages from the.
I think it's roughly 2 to 3 pages, but it's in the first phase of the rate study. Okay. The London economics. Yeah, I can track that down.
Get it to Susan, and she'll get that to committee members. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question is from our newest in-person person, Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I climbed a full set of stairs today just to see Chairman Finch in the flesh, and then he didn't show up. We'll see if I ever come back. Seriously, Mr. Snyder, I've sat on this committee for 9 years now. I feel like I'm chasing my tail round and round and round. And meanwhile, me and my constituents pay more and more and more, specifically to Evergy. It doesn't seem to matter what we do. The bills go up. Every time we think we have it stopped here, it's like whack-a-mole. It pops up somewhere else. So if we made you energy czar of Kansas tomorrow, what would be the first 3 things you would do to control electric rates for my constituents?
Well, the first 2, number 1, we would adjust the transmission delivery surcharge so that they had to wait longer for their money, and that might impact their investment decisions, whether they want to continue to funnel that amount of money.
Do you mean by that an amortization type schedule, or a delay in when they start to collect the fee? Help me understand.
I think so. So we had a bill, I guess it's technically an active bill this year, that would change it from automatic annual recovery of those costs to move it to align with rate cases. So they would have to wait every 2 to 3, 4 years, however often they're going to file for a rate increase.
And before we go from that, would that be retrospective 3-year review, or would we be talking about prospectively? In other words, are they going to get paid before they spend the money or after?
No, it would always be paid after they expend the money.
Okay.
For a
Second thing.
Second thing would be to reduce our capital expenditures. Like I said, we have very deep concerns that we're spending more than we need to. Everyone needs reliability. Certainly none of our members would be here without reliability. Kansas historically, at least over the last 30 years, has had very, very good reliability. I always point to the fact that Oklahoma and Iowa, that they have lower rates and they have good reliability as well. So there's a way to make this happen. And again, this is not Westar and KSPL operated in the state for more than 100 years with fairly routine and standard capital expenditure programs. It's just been in the last 18 to 24 months that they have greatly enhanced their spending plans. The third one, gosh, I'll have to take a rain check on that. I think the first two is plenty to tackle.
There's a lot of other things I'd like to ask. We better give somebody else a chance. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Say on, you had talked about the sustainability transformation plan is going to drive up rates even further, and it's something that they've basically come out and said. And I just wonder, why do you suppose there's not more outrage or concern from folks about that? And I have some thoughts, but I'd be interested in yours. Thank you.
Well, I think number one, there's just a lot of competing issues out in front of people right now. I think the customers that might have challenges with this also have challenges with housing or transportation or food insecurity, other things. So it's hard to pinpoint on this. As it was mentioned, there's a lot of confusion, complexity, acronyms in energy. It's hard to see. You've got some folks that want to see more investment for a particular purpose, generally around climate change activities. So there are some competing interests, and I'll attest it's they've been lobbying here in the Capitol for 50 years. I used to be a KCP&L lobbyist. They're involved in communities. They're generally well regarded in communities, and so people aren't jumping up and down and say, let's go fight the local utility. It's a tough issue.
Thank you.
We're reaching the end of our time, but I'll take the last question. So on the transmission delivery charge, I remember well when that was put in. Transmission rates are set by FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and then those rates would pass on to the KCC. It would make a determination, then the utility could collect. So they're not necessarily unilateral setting of arbitrary rates by the utility on those transmission charges. Those are approved through a federal committee, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And the transmission, and I noticed in the rate study, there was a statement there as well that they noted the expansion of transmission, and they kind of questioned that, and then also the decreased capacity of the fossil fuel plants. But they also made the statement that it possibly was because that extra transmission provided access to lower cost electricity generated elsewhere to bring into the state, if that was the case. And so I think, the picture for transmission charges is a little bit broader than I know you didn't have a whole lot of time to go through it, but that you presented today. And then I just make one other comment, and I know we need to move on, is on the CapEx plan. I remember, and I can't remember if you were here or not at that time, but around 2005, 2006, a similar graph for CapEx expenditures by Westar at that time was presented in this committee, in this room, in fact. And for a variety of reasons, expansion of wind, expansion of transmission, environmental retrofits of the coal plants and so forth. And I guess I just wanted to point out, not only the committee, but those that are online, that, these are kind of long range plans, and you can't necessarily turn on a dime, that you have to kind of set sail in a certain direction, and hopefully it kind of works out. You can make some adjustments, but you're set in that field, because there's a lot of expenses coming down the road, and you have to plan on, and the commission needs access to that data to see if they're used and useful. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of point that out, that there's a lot of nuances, I guess, in utility expenses and how they're collected, who sets them, and so forth. That I just kind of want to provide that clear picture.
Can I make a quick response?
Mm-hmm.
So number one, yeah, we have never alleged that Evergy is doing anything unlawful or not by the letter of the book. Our point is always they're operating under the rules that you all have provided them. Number two, transmission without a doubt has allowed the inflow and outflow of cheaper electricity. We have taken advantage of some of that. We've got members that have wind contracts, and that is because the wind is generally, on an energy basis, cheaper than coal. And then that can reduce our operating expenses. But as I said, we still have all of our coal plants. We're still paying for all of our coal plants. So we're not taking cost out. It's taking a lower operating cost in one portion. And just to illustrate, so because of that, the SPP has the cheapest energy rate in the country. So somehow Kansas has translated the cheapest energy rate in the country to the highest rates in the region. There is a mismatch that needs to be addressed. And all we're asking, we understand people need to invest. We've had significant increases, in the last decade. We're just asking everyone to take a breath. Let other states catch up a little bit and figure out ways. But Evergy's just putting their head down and moving forward without any regard for initiatives from this legislature, potentially from the KCC. They know there's customer concerns about that, and there just needs to be some sort of accommodation.
I think Evergy's presented here and laid out their plan pretty well. And I believe, and this will be my last comment because we have to get on transmission, folks, is I believe Oklahoma, I think OG&E is in the process of filing a rate case this year of around, if I read correctly, about $163 million. And I don't know if they have a fuel rider on their electric bills, but because they're about 2/3 natural gas powered, I can imagine that rider is going to go up significantly, because the price of natural gas has probably doubled in the last year or so, 18 months at least. So anyway.
Possibly. We don't think the best strategy is wait for others to catch up to us.
Thank you for your testimony, and
appreciate the time.
We'll go on now to the transmission providers. Our first presenter is Brett Leopold, who is president of ITC Great Plains. Welcome to the committee, Brett.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. And thanks to the committee for giving me an opportunity to talk to you today about ITC Great Plains and about the transmission grid in the state of Kansas and in the region. I guess you all have my presentation. I don't know if it's going to be displayed, but do I ask them to advance the slides, or will I just cue you to the page that I'm on?
We'll help you with that.
Okay, very good. All right, well, we can move past the introductory slide. The first slide is just about ITC. We're a unique regulated utility in the state of Kansas, and that we are certificated by the Kansas Corporation Commission as the first independent transmission only utility in the state of Kansas. We are regulated by both the KCC and the FERC for various aspects of our operations in the state of Kansas and in the region. Next slide. So there's three legs of the utility stool. A company like Evergy is involved in all three. They own generation, they own the high voltage transmission, and they own the distribution network that connects them to their retail customers. ITC is a transmission only company. We're only involved in that middle part of the network, the high voltage transmission. We don't have any retail customers, we provide transmission that's available for service on a regional tariff that's administered by the Southwest Power Pool. Utilities in Kansas and the region are able to take service under various provisions in that tariff, and energy is transmitted over our high voltage transmission lines. It gives us a unique perspective on planning and building transmission, because we don't have that nexus with generation. We have no particular interest. We're agnostic as far as the generation source that travels over our transmission lines and the customers that those electrons ultimately serve. The next slide just talks about the scope of our company. Here in Kansas, ITC Great Plains is the operating company. We're a transmission provider in 7 or 8 states here in the Midwest. The predominant transmission provider in the entire state of Michigan, about half the state of Iowa, southern Minnesota, and then the operations that you're most familiar with and concerned with are the ITC Great Plains transmission assets here in the state of Kansas. The next slide, this is slide 5, shows ITC Great Plains assets in Kansas and Oklahoma, and the big kind of green overlay represents the Southwest Power Pool region. You will see that since ITC Great Plains came to Kansas with the encouragement of KEDA and other members of the state legislature in 2006, we've constructed nearly 500 miles of high voltage electric transmission in the state of Kansas. Everything we've constructed has been at the highest voltage level in the state, which is 345 kilovolts. So they've been large backbone transmission projects serving the state and the region. And that capital investment is over $500 million today, again, since 2006. The next slide shows our specific projects. You can see two major projects in western and southwest Kansas. The KEDA project from Spearville that went north past Hayes and all the way to the Nebraska state line. The Kansas V plan originated in that Spearville area, went from Spearville to Clark County and over to Barber County. And then that project was continued by other transmission companies at the time, and they built it on into Wichita and south down to Woodward, Oklahoma. We have our Elm Creek to Summit project, which runs from a substation near Concordia, Kansas, down through Ottawa County. And the southern half of that was constructed, owned, and operated by Westar, now an Evergy asset, and concludes at their Summit substation near Salina, Kansas. And then you can see a project we've constructed in Oklahoma as well as on that map. The next slide shows photos of some of our infrastructure here in Kansas. That's slide 7. We've been able, with the particular type of projects and the conditions that we've been able to build in, and the design and engineering choices that we made, to construct almost exclusively these monopole steel structures. I know a lot of times when you think of high voltage transmission, you think of the big Battlestar Galactica, lattice grid kind of transmission towers. Those are needed for specific purposes on specific projects. Many of them exist around the state today, but these single monopoles are less impactful on the landowner, allows them to continue to use their land more freely than sometimes those lattice structures do. And so when we can, which has been most of the time, we've tried to use that less intrusive transmission structure. The next slide, those are photos of some of our substations. Saddle Substation in Ford County. We just finished construction last year in October, and a new wind farm, the Iron Star wind farm interconnects at that substation. And I I partly put these pictures of substations here just to tell you about the impact that our investments have in the state of Kansas. These are, the lines, the substations are major infrastructure investments, major capital investments, and there's significant property tax associated with those. Much of what ITC has built has been in some of the less populous rural counties and in western and southwest Kansas, has a very substantial impact. The property taxes paid on those substations in the counties where those are located. Slide 9 talks about some of our recent projects. The big 345 kilovolt projects that you saw on the map, we have not constructed a project like that since we completed the Elm Creek to Summit project in 2016. Since that time, they've been more modest investments, again, in new substations to interconnect new generation. And over the course of the last 2 years, we dramatically upgraded the technology for communications and operations on our line to enhance our reliability in severe wind and ice conditions. The saddle substations referenced there. And then we needed to reconfigure some things at our Thistle substation in Barber County, again, to accommodate some additional generation that was being interconnected to the line south of our location. When we look to the future, there's going to continue to be a need for additional high voltage transmission. That's being constantly planned, evaluated, analyzed at the Southwest Power Pool. All of the Kansas utilities are very active in those processes. A number of things drive the need for new transmission in our state. A lot of it has been new generation. As Mr. Snyder indicated, there has another common driver of new transmission is load growth. We haven't seen that major load growth in Kansas in the last decade. But as he referenced, as the state and the country move toward enhanced electrification in the business sector and the transportation sector, I know NRECA, which is the National Association of Co-ops, I saw a presentation at that conference in January talking about the move towards increased electrification of the agricultural sector. And so I think we can anticipate that Kansas will see load growth over time from new business and through a move towards electrification, as well as a need to replace aging transmission. There's a lot of transmission in the state that's 40, 50, 60 years old, and at some point, it's the economic and necessary thing to do to rebuild or replace some of that aging transmission infrastructure. Slide 11 is, I guess, a continuation of some of the things I was talking about. What's driving the need for new transmission? As fossil fuel plants are retired, new sources of generation, whether it's a gas, wind, solar, are built, they're often in different locations. It requires new interconnections and new support from the transmission grid. Increasingly, you have customers that are demanding particular access to renewable energy, depending on the location of their operations and their timetable for moving to hit their corporate targets. That may require additional transmission. I already referenced the electrification, the interconnections, and the next topic I'd like to talk about is the transmission relationship to sustaining ourselves in severe weather events. We know that about a year ago, we had a very severe weather event. Cost the nation billions of dollars in economic activity, caused a lot of individuals to suffer with power losses, was particularly devastating in the state of Kansas, and while it had, or in the state of Texas, and while it had impacts in Kansas and this region, fortunately, not nearly as severe as those suffered in some other parts of the country, particularly in Texas. The next slide is just the map showing how essentially the Southwest Power Pool region was had the most severe low temperatures in the entire nation during that event. I know that you have heard presentations, I think, in recent months from the Southwest Power Pool on their analysis of that severe weather event. And so on the next slide about the SPP findings from Winter Storm Uri, they note that SPP's large interconnected network minimized interruptions. And what that's a reference to is the robust transmission grid that's been developed in this region by Kansas utilities and others in the region over the last 10 or 15 years. There were two periods, one for about 2 hours and one for about 90 minutes on consecutive days in the Southwest Power Pool, where generation had to be shed, generation had to be shut down to avoid overloading the transmission system. And whether it's 5 minutes, 90 minutes, or 2 hours, nobody ever wants to have to, shut down access to electricity. But compared to the consecutive days and days and days of no access to electricity in some other parts of the country, it was a relatively minimal disruption. And a major reason why that disruption was minimized is the transmission grid in this region allowed SPP to essentially borrow import energy from regions further east, all the way to the East Coast, to the MISO and PJM networks, and import that to backfill for generation that wasn't available in our region at that time because of the severe weather conditions. And so, when you hear about transmission, this is one thing I always ask, is that when you hear about transmission, you often hear about the costs, you hear about the price tag. I ask you, when you hear about the costs and the price tag of transmission, always ask yourself, what are the benefits that I'm getting from this, and what would the costs be if I hadn't made that investment? If we hadn't made robust investments in transmission over the last decade, that winter weather event, as an example, would have been much more devastating for our manufacturers, our small businesses, and our residential, our people in their homes and in their communities. So reliability is one of the very that's the bedrock of planning transmission. Before everything else, it's build a reliable system that all the customers can rely upon, and continue to operate their businesses and their homes. Next, this is the map that is required to be in every presentation to the House Energy Committee on the abundant wind resources in the state of Kansas and the region. That map is still true today. There's been, tremendous investment in new generation in Kansas in the last 15 years, but significant potential continues to exist, and transmission will be needed to support the delivery of that interconnection and delivery of that energy resource, an energy resource that I think we need to efficiently and economically take advantage of for economic development and for goals in our state and in the region. Slide 17 just highlights some of our prior experience in interconnecting wind in western Kansas. Going to move past that, and I'm going to talk about the costs and payment for transmission. This is slide 18, I believe, who pays for transmission projects. This is an attempt to, in a relatively simple format, explain cost allocation under the Southwest Power Pool tariff. In essence, the big projects, the big backbone projects above 300 kilovolt, like ITC Great Plains has built historically, those are paid for by the entire Southwest Power Pool region. The Kansas portion of that today varies, but the Kansas portion of that regional allocation is around 19% is the latest estimate that I've seen. So 19% of those big projects gets paid, spread across all the Kansas ratepayers. The rest is shared with other ratepayers around the region. As you get to lower voltage projects, more of the cost gets assigned to the local zone where the transmission is geographically located. And at the lowest voltages below 100 kilovolt, 100% of the cost goes to the local zone. The next slide represents that 19% share of the Kansas gets in those regional allocations. Slide 20. According to national studies, and these vary year to year, but always transmission is the smallest part of the retail bill. In the particular study I'm highlighting there, they estimate that about 13% of the retail bills nationwide are attributable to the transmission system. Usually that percentage is higher in the East and in California than it is in the Midwest and Plains. And that's generally been true in Kansas as well. The next slide, slide 21, this highlights a study from a portion of the Acom legislative rate study that was completed. That time they concluded that transmission was approximately 3% of the customer bill in Kansas, a much higher percentage of the bill in the less populous parts of the state, and has been increasing in recent years in western Kansas as a percentage of the bill. Mr. Brungard will talk about that in more detail, so I won't go into great detail on that. When ITC Great Plains has evaluated it, we typically have found the transmission part of the bill in Kansas to be somewhere between 8 and 9%. What the particular percentage is in any given year, maybe it's not the takeaway, but just to keep in mind when you think about rates and rate impact, the transmission part of the bill is not insignificant. It should be scrutinized and paid attention to, like all the capital investments that utilities make in the state, but it's by far the smallest part of the retail ratepayers bill at the end of the day. And again, ask yourself, what are you getting for that investment in transmission? As was discussed in the prior discussion, it's access to cheaper generation, bring cheaper generation to the utilities in the state, a more reliable system. And I can tell you that any given transmission project, particularly the larger ones, are studied for an agonizing and very detailed period of time at the Southwest Power Pool before they're approved. And they're looking through a number of lenses about whether the benefits of that particular project exceed the costs of that project. And things aren't approved to be built unless they meet those pretty conservative metrics that the Southwest Power Pool planning process uses. So you're generally getting a pretty good bang for your buck from your transmission investment. The key is making sure that the people who benefit pay for that, and that the beneficiaries are the ones that are paying for that investment. Let's see. 22. I don't know if I need to spend much more time. I've got some stuff here about the benefits of, again, the economic benefits associated with transmission investment, which are substantial. You can review and we can talk about. But I'd like to leave an opportunity for you to ask some questions, and before I turn it over to Mr. Brungard. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Questions from the committee? Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Leopold, I appreciate you being here, and I actually appreciate what your company does and what you've accomplished in our state. I agree with you that without major transmission investments, we could have been in a very different world last year. And so I do appreciate those things. Notwithstanding that, I don't like paying my electric bill. Okay. So
your cable bill or your phone bill.
Good point. My cable went out Evergy went out last night in my apartment. It came back up Then cable didn't come back up. So I ended up taking half an Ambien and just going to bed. And that's why I'm awake and here today. Okay. Now, there you go.
I'm glad to
A
have
little
you.
bit too much information.
It's okay. Well, I heard about pharmacy benefit managers. Ambien is very inexpensive. I highly recommend it with a prescription and taken as directed. Now, let me seriously, though, talk to you about a couple things. When I think about a substation, okay, I think about the Evergy facility that's about 6 or 8 blocks from my house. They're tying it to one that's about 1.5 miles away by running a major transmission line through a historic park district. And then they're going to tie it to one that's down south by running another transmission line through a historic park district. I understand we got to have it, but I don't like it. But when I see the transmission facilities, though, that ITC operates, I think they're not transmission, substations. It looks to me like it's a different kind of a substation. It looks to me like it's stepped down in my neighborhood, but maybe this is step up from generation. Can you distinguish for me what kind of a substation you are operating as opposed to what I see down the street from my house?
All our substations, well, with a couple of exceptions, are interconnection points to the high voltage 345 kilovolt grid. They have transformers that allow the energy to be transmit at one, like at Elm Creek. There's a step down transformer from 345 to 230 kilovolt. And just generically, when you think about substations, yes, they serve different purposes to, I mean, some are just interconnection points. Some are, in addition, serve that function of stepping down the transmission voltage to move it onto lower voltage lines.
Whether they're step up or step down, the ITC owned facilities, are they included in the transmission charge that I see on my bill? The cost of those facilities, or is that handled in some different way?
All of the ITC investments are ultimately recovered from rate pay, including in the substations, are ultimately recovered by ratepayers in the Southwest Power Pool region. So yes, you are paying some portion of the cost for that substation in that photo in your retail.
But that fits at the Southwest Power Pool tier level of the entire region paying for that, as opposed to me paying more simply because I can see it out my window somewhere.
Well, it
Or not, maybe not. I don't know.
Depends on the facility outside your window may be shared by the entire region, or it might be paid 100% by the ratepayers of Evergy.
Yeah, I'm talking about the ITC owned facilities that you showed us in the slide. Are those all regional paid for?
Those happen to be regionally shared because of the size of those facilities and the voltage. Yeah.
Just one final quick question. My transmission charge last month was 14.738% of my retail bill for Evergy Power. Should I be happy about that? Is that a good number compared to other companies or other regions of the country?
The national average that I had in that particular slide was 13%. I don't recall the year that was, of that study. It would have been a recent number. So, but I'll defer to more knowledgeable people about the Evergy rates to tell you about that 14% portion of your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Leopold. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Delperdin.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So appreciate you hearing my presentation. Can you hear me now? There we go. Got to lean into it. So, electric grid overall has got thousands of transformers out there, but I'm thinking on the high voltage transmission portion, it's probably 3 to 5% of the overall infrastructure. Is that kind of a good general number?
Could be more, but yeah, it's there's probably more investment in the lines than in the substations, expressed as a percentage, for sure, substantially more. Yeah.
What I'm leading to is on the high voltage transmission portion where there's just fewer of them, what steps are you guys taking either have been or now or in the future, just to help harden that grid, help protect it from whatever could happen, whether it's natural or foreign adversaries, et cetera, because we're hearing more and more and more about the possibility of cyber attacks, EMPs, et cetera. Could you give us any insight to that?
Yeah, I can do that. And first, I want to thank you for not quizzing me on pharmacy acronyms. My head's swimming with the energy acronyms. I certainly don't want to get in that direction. But no, this is a huge issue, both the physical security and the cyber security aspects of the electric grid. And there's major investment and major attention by all utilities, certainly ours, in the way that we design and construct these, and frankly, the choices we make of vendors, where the parts and the technology is manufactured. So there's a lot of precautions taken. We're a member of the Kansas Fusion Center. We get a lot of very advanced information from them about threats, cyber threats around the globe and in the country and in the region, so that we can anticipate and be prepared to address those things. I will tell you that the national transmission grid and the transmission grid in this region is, it's fairly robust. It's designed to have, outlets and redundancies where if a particular part of the network is taken out by a dramatic storm or a cyber attack, that there are ways to continue to provide service to the customers that rely upon that transmission line. I mean, if you get a big part of your network blown out by a tornado or crippled by a cyber attack, you can't avoid all interruptions. But I think the grid is pretty secure, but it's the top of the list of things that keep a utility up at night. Is the potential for cyber attack on the transmission grid, and so it's top of mind for us.
And then could you give us some insight to where some of these transformers, where are they actually manufactured? They're not made in the States, are they? They all come from abroad.
That's a great question. I can get back to you on that, but I know that it's extremely long lead time. I mean, we have to order these things a year or more in advance. We try to keep some kind of standard stuff always in the pipeline in anticipation of an emergency or a failure and the need to replace something unexpectedly. It's a major project because of their size and weight, usually to bring them in by rail and ultimately shut down the county roads to take these things inch by inch to their ultimate location. But as far as the location of the particular manufacturer that ITC has used, I can find that out for you, sir, but I don't know.
I'd like to know that, just curiosity.
Yeah.
I believe it was May of 2020, there was an executive order that came out presidential level of where we can source these from, as far as whether it's acquisition or import and transfer, but there were certain maybe countries or manufacturers that we were banned, and I'm not sure what that ramification means to you guys or what it's done.
Right.
So, thank you.
Any other questions for Brett? I will draw the committee's attention to slide 6. It's a map of the projects that ITC has been involved with. The first one is the V plan, which was a joint project, but it was, if I'm correct, Brett, that was the first large high voltage line between eastern and western Kansas. Back then, we didn't have any high voltage transmission available at that point.
That's true. Yeah. And with all the renewable development, that was sort of a critical step forward to be able to, move some of that power out of the sunflower zone. And that's probably a good segue. I would tell you that I think that we probably should have built some additional high voltage transmission, which would have resulted in fewer lower voltage upgrades in the sunflower zone, which sunflower customers are now paying for. Probably need some additional regional big lines in western Kansas to take some of that load off the sunflower system.
And the one other project I'll point it to, because the committee's heard about KETA before, Kansas Electric Transmission Authority, the KETA project line there goes from Spearville up to Nebraska, and that was to connect. You're talking about reliability, kind of a ring structure around the state as well as other states within the SPP, so increases reliability. So, thank you, Brett.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is James Brungart from Sunflower Electric. Welcome to the committee, James.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Sharber. Committee members, thank you for letting me be here today to talk to you a little bit about Sunflower's transmission system and some of the things we're working on. And thank you to Mr. Leopold for that wonderful lead-in this morning. I do have a presentation that I believe all of you have copies of. Not a ton of slides. I'll just some of this has already been talked about already this morning, so I'll skim over those as much as I can. Looking at the time and making sure we get out of here by 10:30. So the first slide is the service territory map. Sunflower is an electric generation and transmission cooperative. We are owned by our 7 member owners, which you'll see there on the slide. Those 7 member owners also make up our board of directors. So they're responsible for approving our tariff rates, developing our strategic plan, things like that. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a map, which you've seen already this morning, of the transmission zones throughout SPP. So while our board does set our tariff rates for power supply side, as we've talked about this morning, transmission is regulated by FERC through the SPP. Sunflower is a member of SPP on behalf of our 7 member owners. So our transmission service is administered under the SPP tariff, and we have a transmission formula rate that's approved by FERC and then included as part of the SPP tariff to calculate the transmission rate for our particular zone. If we go to the next slide, you'll see, so who pays for transmission projects? How are costs actually allocated? I know Mr. Leopold talked about this already. I won't go into a lot of detail. The graphic below is one that our external affairs department put together a few years ago that I think explains it pretty well, where you look at those facilities 100 kV and below, which are paid by the local zone. Those voltages that are within 100 kV and 300 kV, those are the ones that are the highway byway allocation, where 67% of the cost is assigned to the local zone and 33% is assigned to the region. That's your most common cost allocation of transmission facilities throughout SPP, and that's the one that I'll talk a little bit more about here as we go on in the presentation. And then voltage above 300 kV, those 345 kV facilities, those are regionally funded among all the transmission owners in SPP. So if we look at the next slide, we talk about transmission investment in SPP since 2012. You'll notice on the bar graph down below, and then also in the notes up top, SPP has completed $8.4 billion of transmission projects, and they're scheduled to complete an additional $2.5 billion. And Sunflower's share of that, we've received $360 million of NTCs assigned from SPP, which equates to $152 million of cost allocated to our member transmission customers. So the problem has become increasingly, from a rate perspective, has become very obvious, and something that we've been very focused on over the last couple of years, dating all the way back to 2012. So if we look at the next slide, this is a graph that kind of illustrates, okay, what's the driver for that? Why are we seeing such significant cost increases in our transmission rate? You look at the red bars, that shows our load from year to year on the Sunflower system. So load, as is common in Kansas, remains flat for that 12-year period. If you look at the green bars, what the green bars represent is the amount of what we call non-affiliated generation, or those wind facilities that are being built in our zone that are not used to serve our local load. And you'll notice back in 2009, we had 500 354 megawatts of wind generation in the Sunflower Zone. And today we're looking at more than 3,500 megawatts of wind generation in our zone. You compare that to our average peak load of 1,100 to 1,200 megawatts. So you're seeing nearly 3 times as much wind generation as load in the zone. What that equates to is that all that additional generation is putting a lot of stress on the local transmission system, which is designed to serve much lower loads. And so as a result of that, Sunflower's transmission rate today is 320% higher than the SPP average. And it's driven mostly by that increased demand on the system because of all that generation that's not used to serve local load. So that kind of gives you an illustration of what the problem is that we're seeing when it comes to our transmission rates. If you go to the next slide, we look at what are what's the best way to solve this problem. And so for many years, dating all the way back to 2012, Sunflower staff has worked closely with the SPP members to examine cost recovery and how costs for those transmission facilities that are in our zone are recovered. The cost allocation waiver, or C2 waiver, is something that Sunflower sponsored at SPP and allows, what it does is it allows TOs in SPP to identify those projects, those transmission projects that aren't necessitated by the local load, that are rather driven by those generation facilities coming into the zone, causing upgrades, and then making sure that the local zone doesn't end up paying for those, like we're seeing today, especially in the Sunflower system. So if this is approved through the SPP process, so a utility such as Sunflower would identify those projects that it thinks falls under the C2 waiver. It would then submit those to SPP for approval. And if those are approved, then those go from being the highway byway type allocated projects to a regionally funded project, which results in having a much greater, much lower transmission impacts for the local zones such as Sunflower, and also allows more proper cost recovery from the consumers that are driving the need for those transmission facilities. If the generator is serving load outside of the zone, then the zone that has the generator shouldn't necessarily be required to pay for all of those upgrades. It should be more properly assigned to those that are receiving the benefits of that generation. So if we go to the next slide, I won't go into a lot of detail on these, but these are the 3 criteria that need to be satisfied in order for a project to qualify under the C2 waiver. So the first one is a capacity criterion. What that does is that looks at the nameplate generation capacity compared to the physical load that's in the zone, does the comparison and see if the generation exceeds what the load that's in the zone, then that you would meet the criterion for A. Flow criterion is more of an engineering specific, type of analysis where it studies the flows on the lines and determines how the generators are impacting that. And then a benefit criterion, which to me is the most important, just high level question of who's benefiting from these generation facilities. And just because the wind farm might be, down the road from you, if it's not helping lower your electric rate or it's not supplying the local load, then those customers shouldn't necessarily be responsible for paying for those facilities or the transmission upgrades that go along with them. Okay, if we go to the next slide. Get it here. So that's the problem we've seen back to 2012. If we look going into the future, will this problem continue? What this slide shows you is the generation interconnection requests under study currently at SPP. You'll notice there's still over 40,000 megawatts of wind that's being studied, more than 37,000 megawatts of solar, about 8,800 megawatts of storage. This is the battery type facilities, and then a little over 5,000 megawatts of gas. So with all that renewable generation, that's currently in the queue, that's being studied, A lot of them are most likely going to want to locate in sunflowers territory where it's flat and it's windy. This is a problem that we think is going to continue into the future, and so that's why we see the need for things like the cost allocation waiver to address those cost impacts on our member owners. The next slide talk just a little bit about sunflowers resource planning. Obviously, when you think about transmission, the piece that has to tie into that is how you plan your overall generation. And so just a couple high level points here that as a load serving entity in SPP, we are responsible for securing enough capacity to serve our load plus a 12% reserve margin. We do that by using our own physically owned facilities that we own and operate, and then also through purchase power contracts. And then as a result of the events last February, and just in keeping with everything that's going on with SPP and many of the electric utilities throughout SPP, we are in the process of examining our resource planning process with our board and determining if we're doing everything as best as possible and if there's any changes that we need to be made. So it is important to know that any new generation resources that may go into the queue, if they're approved through the SPP process, they would have to be planned accordingly through SPP, and then any transmission upgrades would also have to go through the SPP planning process. So in conclusion, transmission, is planned via the SPP process. It's administered through SPP. It's provided on an open access basis to all who request it. So Sunflower's seen a lot of pressure of people requesting transmission service for this generation that's being located in the zone, but not being used to serve local load. There's a number of variables that have caused increase in transmission investment over the years, whether it be reliability issues, the integration of renewable generation, focus on grid resiliency, and it's our belief that if costs aren't properly assigned, transmission zones such as Sunflowers can see significant cost increases, which are driven by these generation facilities, can result in our member owners paying a lot higher rates than necessary, just due to their geographical location and the desire of others to put those generation facilities in our zone. So I know I went through that fairly quickly. So on the last slide, I do have my contact information. I love talking about this stuff. So if, after today, if you have additional questions or there's anything I can help you with, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. I'd love to visit with you.
Thank you, James, and thanks for your first presentation before the committee. So
Gotcha.
we hope to see you again. Committee, have any questions? Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Brungard, for your presentation today. It appears to me, yes, you're going to have some real problems with all the generation and in your territory. Getting back to the C2 waivers, a couple of questions. What is the normal time frame for a C2 waiver? By the time you go ahead, you meet all the criteria, and then you apply for the C2 waiver. And the second follow-up would be, have you applied for C2 waivers, and have you been successful?
Yeah, great questions. So I should have mentioned. So the C2 waiver has been approved by the SPP through the SPP stakeholder process. It was filed at FERC. FERC, to summarize, very high level, FERC came back and wanted a little more clarity, in particular on how the process for determining if a project qualifies under the C2 waiver. FERC wanted a little more definition behind that. So SPP is currently working on doing that filing, and that filing is scheduled to be made here in the first quarter of 2022. Then it'll go to FERC. If FERC approves the process, then we'll actually have the C2 waiver approved by FERC, and we can actually start submitting projects and changing the cost allocation for those projects. Sunflower has developed a list of some projects that we believe would qualify under that. You think of the sunflower transmission system as a whole, we've got, hundreds of millions of dollars of plant investment. There's just a few projects that we think qualify that we think would be fall under the C2 waiver. Does that answer your question?
Well, it answers most of my question, I guess. How long does how long does it take them to make that decision to, I guess that's one of my main questions.
Yeah. So
Who knows?
my experience with FERC filings is that usually within 60 to 120 days, you'd expect to get an order. With something like a filing as significant as that, it may be a little different. But
Well, that's much quicker than I anticipated.
yeah, it doesn't always end up that way.
Thank you very much.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Mr. Berngard, I really appreciate your presentation here.
Thank you.
It's opened a window to some things I hadn't thought about, and I too like to talk about these things. So anytime your power goes out and you don't want to take Ambien, feel free to give me a call. I'll give you my cell number and we can put each other to sleep talking about these things.
I've got 3 kids, so I don't sleep much anyway.
Wait till you're my age. I'd like to direct your attention back to your slide on SPP transmission zones. I think I understand the difference between zone and region, but when we're talking about the SPP transmission zone slide, or even the next one, which is who pays for transmission projects, if we're looking at a so-called local zone below 100 kV, 100% is getting paid by the local zone.
That's correct.
So if I look at the transmission zone map, if there's 100 kV or below transmission line in Wichita, is it that whole purple blob that I see there from about 81 highway clear over to the Kansas border, or is the zone something different?
Yeah, so what the zones are just geographical. This map is just showing you geographically the transmission zones for each TO and SPP. So, for example, Evergy, obviously merged with KCP&L, but you'll notice on the map that the transmission zones are still separate.
Right.
So from a transmission perspective, depending, what you could do is find the location of where you were living, and then you'd be paying the transmission costs for that zone wherever it's located on the map. So you'll notice Sunflower obviously is the one that I'm most familiar with, would be the light green all throughout western and central Kansas, and then Midwest Energy has their facilities that kind of carve out right there in the middle of our.
See where it is. But if you have a 100 kV or below transmission line that is within that kind of lime green blob that represents Sunflower's TO territory, does the cost of that 100 kV line within that green blob, is it divided in essence equally throughout that Sunflower territory, that green area, or is it handled differently?
No, if it was a 100 kV or below, in Sunflower's particular position, it wouldn't be included in the transmission formula rate, so it wouldn't be socialized among all the transmission owners. It would be socialized if depending on whether it's providing a distribution function or a transmission function and how it's classified, but it would be classified by the Sunflower member owner among their customers. So if you look at the map before where I define all the Sunflower member territories,
Right.
if it say you had a 34.5 line, 34.5 kV line that was used in that area, it would be paid for by the customers in that member territory.
So would that just be whatever the local cooperative is?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Then when we talk about above 100 kV, we have a allocation formula as set forth on your who pays for transmission of 33 to the region, 67 to the zone. What is the region as compared with the zone?
So the region is everybody that's on the map in SPP.
Everybody in the Southwest Power Pool?
Yes, sir. Yes, that's all. And then the zone is the particular, like the sunflower zone or the
And
Midwest.
then the same would be true with respect to 300 kV and above.
Correct. Yep.
So to try to cut to the chase as quick as I can, thank you. If ITC builds a transmission facility that is 300 kV and above, does the cost of that go to the entire SPP, or is any of that regionalized, or not regionalized? Is any of that assigned to a zone or a particular, in your case, cooperative?
Yeah. So, generally speaking, very generally speaking, in order for ITC to build a 345 line, it would have to go through the SPP planning process, approved by SPP through the stakeholder process and everything. Then if they built a 345 line, the cost would be assigned to the entire region throughout SPP.
So if I get ITC to build more 345 kV lines in Kansas, people in Arkansas are going to be paying for it too.
They're going to be paying their load ratio share of it. Yeah.
Load ratio share.
Yeah. So
As distributed across the entire SPP?
correct. Yep.
But I still like people in Arkansas paying for transmission in Kansas. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Representative Turner.
Thank you. Yeah, quick question. I know we're running short on time, but very good presentation. And your one slide, I don't know the number of it here.
Thank you.
It's the one that shows how wind construction has taken off and has taxed the system, as you say, because it's not, you're having to build, the wind generation is not there to serve local load. It's being moved into the urban centers because everybody loves wind. The perception is it's all good, but nobody wants it built near them, so it's built way out in your area, right?
Right.
So you mentioned later in the slides that SPP now rolls that into their process. Is it a case where as much as they can possibly build can be built, and it's the problem of somebody building to move it, or does it ever get to a point where they say, you know what, you can't build anymore? Has anybody ever stopped a project and said, we simply can't build any more in this area?
Yeah, I know there has been, when I talk to the people, our vice president of planning that works most close with SPP, he's had a lot of pushback about the amount of generation that's being studied at SPP, that's looking at being put into service in SPP. From Sunflower's perspective, we're not anti-wind. We have purchase power agreements with wind developers. We're not anti-transmission. We believe that, like you said, if somebody puts wind, in our transmission zone and it's serving load in the urban areas, that our member owners shouldn't be required to pay for it. Just because we're located where it's flat and it's windy and it's bad enough we can't play golf all the time. That now we have to pay higher transmission rates. So that's the whole goal behind the C2, is to make sure that the stress isn't put on those local zones. As far as what's obviously from that graph that I showed you, there's a lot that's going to be studied over the years at SPP, and a lot of generation facility that wants to come online. My personal hope would be that SPP would really examine whether or not those generation facilities are needed, and whether or not there's other drivers besides the operational and economic benefits of those facilities.
But historically, none of them have not been built. Everything that they want to build has been built up to this point. But as you say, maybe in the future there'll be some throttling of that.
Yeah, we hope so.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And just a clarification, so those generation projects get queued up at SPP, and I don't know that all of them get approved. Is that correct, James? Or
Right. So the ones that typically get built are the ones that are approved through the process. Yeah. There are a lot of applications for, facilities and everything. And that's why the SPP planning process is so important, from an operational and economic standpoint.
thank you, James. Again, Committee, looking forward to next week. On Tuesday, we'll have Professor Burke Griggs from Washburn Law School here to talk about mineral and property rights and right-of-way. I think Representative Carmichael is tuning up for that right now. March 10th, we're going to have two bills for hearing, Senate Bill 417 and House Bill 2281, which deals with the 988 fee only piece of that bill. So you might want to look at those a little bit ahead of time and check those out. So any other business for the committee? All right. Well, thank you to the presenters. Have a